Really excited for tonight. I'm with Bourgeois, head of performance at Voyager Academy. I'm really excited to be hosting Justin Trang, who is the head of junior development at Athletica, and also a exercise physiologist by trade. Justin, fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Luke.
Yeah, I've been looking at when we can have this conversation, when we can start this process for a long time, as you know from our conversations, because it is such a big piece of looking at really ensuring our athletes get the most out of themselves. I think probably just to simply start it off, and again, obviously you're the expert, you've been doing this for a long time now. I'd start with a question for you, and again, really want to hand it over to you, Justin, is what's the goal of sort of, what's your goal of off-court physical development?
Yeah, I think if I start from the beginning with like how I coach, I guess the goal, if I use this PowerPoint here, the goal of the junior development program that we have here is simply two things. Number one, it's increasing the athlete's adaptability. So I want to develop really good movement skills on how they run, jump, change directions, hand-eye coordination. Like a lot of junior athletes I find these days, they don't play, Luke, right? So they don't play outside after school. They don't go down to the park and make up games and make up their own rules. And as a result, I found that a lot of the juniors that come in to see me, they're really one-dimensional in their movement. And as you and I both know, like tennis is a very chaotic sport. So learning to be adaptable in different environments by improving general movements gives juniors a big advantage. Right. And then there's number two, which is increasing players' availability. To get better at tennis, you need to spend time on court, training, competing. And as kids grow up, the intensity of play increases. So they need to become more robust through strength development. Okay, you won't see any high performance program these days, whether or not it's in tennis or in any other sports, where strength development isn't a part of training. So it's about getting our kids as confident as possible in the gym, but also for parents that are here tonight and for you and I, for them to get as confident in the gym as possible. So when I talk about strength training for juniors, it's not about our 12-year-olds lifting, 100 kilos. It's purely getting them to be able to handle their own body weight and move efficiently.
Backtracking there, it's actually a really interesting comment you made there about how kids play. I know for me as a kid growing up, we really had one rule, which was when the street lights come on, you've got to come inside. And you sort of see all that sort of general play that we're talking about, because it's quite interesting here. I know some of the things I've had to program in is just some of the games that we naturally played as kids. And you can see when those sort of skills are there of even just really simple throw, reaction, catching games and catching drills. If they are missing, it can make life a little bit harder at a higher level. But it's a really good point.
Yeah, I think like if a kid can't catch a ball, balance on one leg, how can we expect them to be able to do very tennis specific skills, going to the net to receive low volleys, move their hands in a specific way when they're hitting ground strokes or serving? Like it's really hard for them to conceptualize that when they can't do the simple things right.
Yeah, and most true. And I know a lot of the rules really now, for probably the parents out there, it's really around time on devices, and that's sort of where you see one of the shifts in how it is, because it does make your role quite challenging. And I know for us on the court, obviously it helps to work with great athletes. But it's something I know you've really spent a lot of time on in this space recently.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Well, I think when you sort of talk about obviously adaptability, that's quite sort of straightforward and common sense. When you look at availability, I mean, what sort of hours are you talking about? I mean, if we're looking at sort of a typical player that's trying to really sort of think about the higher end, how they're trying to reach the higher levels of the game, what would you sort of suggest is a good sort of amount of time to start developing these skills, and probably to what ages? Because I'm sure it varies according to the points of the development you're at.
Yeah, I think it's very important when we look at achieving these two goals. You got to understand where your child's growth patterns are at, and that's when we start to talk about ideas in our industry around what we call Peacock Velocity, or the growth spurt. So we've got kids at Precision who are starting at the age of 10, all the way up to our Voyager kids who are working with us at year 10 to 12. So I think the amount of tennis that they play, they could get away with, dedicating 1 to 2 hours a week outside of their training commitments to really focus on just general physical development. And I think what parents will find and what athletes will find is that the performance on court will be advantaged massively.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think sort of this is something that I've only really sort of come into to understand a little bit more is around that sort of Peacock Velocity. Could you probably go into more detail there on again, we know it's growth spurts, on what that is and whether it's our trainability charts or to sort of explain, because I think it is something that it's becoming more well known and more documented. Tennis seems to be a little bit late to the party, though, and a lot of the other sports are really on this from a really early age. Could you probably explain that into a little bit more detail?
Yeah, cool. So to give parents a bit of context, like in Australia, you find that a lot of different sports, from tennis, cricket, soccer, whatever sport it is, they categorize competition by under 10s, under 12s, under 14s. But as we know, during that growth spurt period of time, you see some kids who are, very developed, and you see some kids very underdeveloped or late developers. Okay, so when we have a look at charts like this, for example, Peacock Velocity explains that variation. So it's the period of time where your child experiences the greatest acceleration in growth and stature. So in other words, your child predominantly has 3 growth spurts: one at birth, one early childhood, and then more commonly for girls, that it happens around 11 and 12, and for boys 13, 14, which is what we refer to as Peacock Velocity. So what's probably more important is, and what I'm more interested in is predicted maturity offset, which is how many years they are away from Peacock Velocity. So, some kids, female, 10-year-old might be 1 year away from Peacock Velocity. Male who's 11 years old might also be, or 12-year-old might also be 1 year away from Peacock Velocity. So although they're 2 chronological age years apart, they're both tracking at the same development stage. And the reason why that's really important is because the way that we train athletes, although it's not the only reason, but one of the factors in how we train athletes needs to be dictated by where they're at with their growth and maturation.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I know I was having a bit of a chat to Niels, because I think sort of learning more about this, because I sort of look at this, the idea, the opportunities to work on certain things at certain times and how that can actually produce good results. Is there a way you could sort of probably give all our families here probably a little bit of insight into that?
Yeah, so, well, when I first see a junior, like the first thing I want to know about when I test them is where they're at with their growth and maturation, right? So in this chart here, you can see there's Peacock Velocity, and each athlete will fall into a certain biological band. So they might be 2.5 years away, 1.5 years away, or even 1 year or 2 years past Peacock Velocity. And that's what I determine as predicted maturity offset. Now, the way that we train athletes, in some ways dictated by where they're at on this sliding scale. So the first group of athletes that we have are the ones in pre-Peacock Velocity, and these are around 10 to 12-year-olds. And you'll see it on court where the really talented ones, or the ones that are deemed talented, aren't necessarily the ones who are more powerful or stronger on court. They're just able to move their body better, have better coordination. So what we do with these athletes is start to really work on motor skill development. So, how will they run? How will they jump? How will they land and decelerate and change direction, hand-eye coordination? And at the same time, we start to introduce more gym-based movement patterns on how to perform a squat, how to hinge better, how to lunge better, how to use their core a lot better. And that helps to really create that foundation of physical learning. Now, the second group of athletes, I guess, that we see here are the ones in Peacock Velocity. So for girls, that usually happens around 11, 12, and for boys around 13, 14. Now, I've had kids who came back, from the most recent lockdown where they grew 6 centimeters in 4 months. So we have these kids who are growing at such a rate that sometimes we see skill drop, sometimes we also see results drop. And funnily enough, like coincidentally, sorry, these are the kids that around this age where they start to quit sport because they're not succeeding, right? So what we look to do is then, all right, how can we nurture this growth? We can talk about nutrition, we can talk about recovery, and from a physical perspective, continue to refine those motor skills and start to intensify gym-based movement patterns, so that by the time they're past peak height velocity or post peak height velocity, they're ready to hit the ground running with your more traditional training methods like strength development, power development, speed, agility, even aerobic fitness. So we're slowly moving away from general skills into strength development, and slowly moving our focus from general athletic qualities into more tennis sport specific demands. And I think it's very important for parents to understand that when kids are young, they're doing enough tennis, right? Like I've got kids who play 10 to 12 hours of tennis before they even hit peak height velocity. So what they need to do, in my mind, away from the tennis court, is just work on general physical qualities around, change direction, how to decelerate and land really well, because those becoming very adaptable, as I said earlier, will help them become more adaptable on court.
Yeah, it's great to see some questions coming in, guys. And if you do have any, please fire away. But before I sort of go to that question there, it's quite interesting what you touched on, because so often now Tennis Australia has created a system where results, basically they reward results. And we see that often with kids that do go through that peak height velocity slightly earlier, may have some physical advantages for a short period of time. I do know as well, if you look at some of those periods too, how it can actually limit your certain, I know from a suppleness perspective to look at it does help to do things quite early, because my son tonight, he's wondering why he's one of 120 girls that's doing gymnastics on a Thursday evening with his sister. And it was quite interesting. I spoke to Niels, the S&C at Precision, and he said the exact same thing. He's actually put his son into gymnastics purely from that flexibility perspective, and actually looking to see how you can really make those huge significant inroads quite early. There probably is a bit more education in what we can do there, because I've seen a lot of kids that have been early maturers, again, quite early, and that they reach that point where sometimes their skills probably don't quite really sort of get to their full potential, because again, they can overpower kids. They move into their strength phases, and their skill acquisition phase is actually quite short, because and it leads me into the question here, which is a great question, which I'll throw out to you there, Justin, is how do you know when a child is at their peak height velocity? And obviously the presumption is that the child, it varies from child to child, or some may have a longer growth spurt than others.
Mm-hmm. So we use we look at anthropometry data. Okay, so there's a lot of longitudinal studies out there that help us to estimate peak height velocity. You can have a look at measuring the height, seated height and weight. For males, there's a calculation where you're looking at seated height and the chronological age. And for females, we're looking at height and chronological age. So what a longitudinal study is years ago, they did a study where they tracked hundreds of different juniors over 18 to 20 years. And what they've done is they've tracked their growth, and they've tried to figure out, okay, what equation can we use? Now, this equation that we use at Precision to estimate peak height velocity obviously is a guidance. It's not perfect, but it gives us a good backing as to where they're at roughly with their growth, which is more than what many other places would do.
Yeah, it's good to have that. And I think also too is it's simple measuring. Like if you had a child that grew 2 centimeters in 2 weeks, you'd probably sort of start having this could be sort of that period where they are going through that, because I think talking to some of the challenges too, when they do, like you spoke of it earlier, where that is when they're most susceptible to get injured. I mean, you sort of think about, and you explain it better than I would, and obviously how our bones and ligaments and all the sort of things are going through that process of stretching out. Because I know it's one of the things that we try to look at managing for our full-time program, with looking at their load as well, and ensuring that they're not putting undue stress on their body while they're going through that really sort of challenging phase.
Yeah, I think it's important that parents understand that they're the ones that will know their child best. They'll know if they're feeling a bit off on any given day or any given week. They know that when they're really tired and get really grumpy, for example, there's clear signs that show that an athlete might be training a bit too much, starting to get a few niggles from 1 to 2 niggles once a month. So there's clear signs that parents can look out for that will help them dictate how much training they should be doing.
Yeah, and that's important too, like really listening to your body, because obviously when there is sort of joint pain and it's lasting longer than a day or two, like that's where you've really got to be smart and ensure. And that's one of the things we always encourage the kids to do is actually talk to your coaches, really be clear and communicate when you do have some of those sort of moments, because it's a time where you've got to be really, really smart.
I think it's important. Like another point is that when you start a child early with their physical development, teaching them areas around warm up and recovery isn't necessarily going to benefit them at the time, but giving them that exposure at that age almost builds good habits so that by the time they hit peacock velocity and further, those certain qualities and the habits that they create are just second nature. So those are the kids that I see that when they get into peacock velocity, there's less injuries happening, because I asked them, all right, what sort of warm up are you doing? Bang, 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 bang. Like they know exactly what they're going through. What sort of recovery are they doing? Are they eating in between matches? Are they eating well before and after matches? Are they eating well every day? Those are the kids that have built really good habits at a young age because they've had exposure to good physical development and diversity. And as a result, they're the kids that I find have longevity in the sport.
Yeah, well, it's probably two parts to that, because again, to sort of give you another question here is, what role does nutrition and protein replacements have in regards to players gaining strength, repairing muscles, recovery? I know it's probably another question for but I think it's a really good one to talk to.
Yeah, I think like as especially I find a lot of the boys in the Voyager program like always talking about protein shakes. So put it very simply to parents, protein helps with, bring it back a tiny bit. When we train, we stress the body, right? There's a breakdown in muscle tissue. So protein helps with building back that muscle, which aids recovery. Do kids need protein shakes? Most likely not. If they're having adequate amount of protein from day to day, which is split up in between, morning, afternoon, night, there's no reason why they need protein shake and supplements. I think it's important that people understand that in order to maximize protein intake, it's not just from having one shake. Your body can only actually take in so much protein in one go. So having a really balanced diet, and which is what our dietitian Atlanta really focuses on, is going to benefit them in the long term.
Yeah, I think changing tact a little, it's, again, we do talk a lot about training volume and ensuring, this is where I feel like we've really started to get that message across with a lot of people that are doing more appropriate training loads. Again, it is something that we want it to be progressive, where they're gradually building up to what they can cope. And that'll vary from athlete to athlete to again, from a lot of different factors. But again, one of the things, I know it's probably one of the advantages of the academy program that we have, especially for our younger ones that are under 15, is a lot of their afternoons, they do have more time, just being part of that and having the opportunity to train during the day. But we see a lot of that early specialization, where, again, we talked about earlier, where a lot of the things naturally happen through play. There are some definite dangers in and around that. I'd love to get your sort of perspective on that.
Yeah, early specialization, very, very big topic amongst parents when they interact with me. I think there's definitely athletes out there, proven athletes and well documented athletes like Andre Agassi or Tiger Woods in golf, that have started at a very young age and succeeded, right? But for the vast majority of athletes, that's not going to happen. it doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of research out there that shows very little evidence around increasing training and specialization before puberty, increasing success. But what there is evidence for is a greater risk of injury. In my mind, again, I come back to that idea of adaptability. Athletes who are very one-dimensional in movement aren't able to adapt to the rigors of sport as they grow older. As I said before as well, as kids get older, the intensity of play increases, so their body needs to become more robust and adaptive. The second thing is burnout. Okay, so burnout from psychological stresses. Luke, you touched on before, we have late developers and early developers. And what I've found is that the late developers who aren't really succeeding at the time because other athletes are growing at such a fast rate, they struggle to cope with loss, not understanding that if they stay in the sport, work on the technical aspect of it, just continue to work at it, at some point, both levels of development comes to the same point, physical development, right? Your early developers rise early, the late developers come and join the game late. So what we find is that there's a lot of burnout from psychological stress, and for parents as well, it's important to understand that during this time, as I said before, there is a decrease in skill during Peacock Velocity. There is a decrease in results during this time. So what are the areas then that we need to work on?
Just sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. And that's I think where is decrease, because I remember going through that myself. I mean, the kids literally their arm might be 1 centimeter longer the next day. Like, it's how quickly the body can change. And really, I think that's one thing that's really, really important, where they go through that really awkward stage of trying to find their body, because I know that's something that we hear a lot. Obviously, people have expectations. They want to see their kids continue to improve. To me, when I see a child in that phase, I'm thinking, fantastic. This is awesome, because we're still growing. And that's a really, really good thing. But sorry to cut you off there, mate.
That's all right. So like I said, the other one was, and we spoke about this a few days ago, Luke, the ceiling effect of physical learning. What I found that is with, especially in tennis players, the ones who specialize early because they haven't been exposed to a variety of different sports and movements, they have a low ceiling of physical learning. So when it becomes, chatting to coaches, working on the areas that they need to work on, they find it really hard to find cues to teach that athlete specific movements, as opposed to kids who have tried a lot of different sports, playing gymnastics, playing soccer, where they've developed foot skills and jumping and landing. They're the kids that have a greater ceiling of learning. So what I find is, sorry.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, right. So what I've found is, the kids who have tried different sports and sampled a lot of different sports are the ones who have a high capacity to learn later on in life from a physical perspective.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of studies. I'm always a huge fan of the Canadians. They took it along to athletic development. That's what really one of the key things they've seen. And to me, the Canadian Federation, what they're doing on the world stage now is amazing. And one of the things they always talk to is that idea of sampling, especially pre-Peacock Velocity. So you can actually do that, whether it's baseball, so you can actually launch that ball. And to me, the correlation between your throwing capacity and serve, there's so many different elements there where you actually look to see that mixture of athletes. And again, being a former pro, like you see so many of my sort of contemporaries, their ability to go to any sport, whether it's playing soccer or golf, and you can see how they've just developed such a great, well-rounded skill set, which enables you to really, really play at the highest level. Again, talking about that ceiling, because I know I always talk about what you can and can't do with your body. We'll determine what you can and can't do on the court. And whether it's our range of motion or our flexibility or just movement patterns, it's so critical, because the game gets very, very fast and very, very physical as you start progressing. But I think it's also worth talking about. Obviously, tennis is a repetition-based sport, and there still is like appropriate hours that are required. And I know this was something that I was quite interested in, being recently selected to go across to the States and seeing a lot of those major academies and seeing the volume, the training load of a lot of the kids in the States, and a lot of the academies and the coaches that are producing top players. They still do have a relatively high amount. And I know personally, I'm really proud that I'm also not just a tennis coach, I'm now a tennis parent. That's where it's great to have people like Justin to talk to. And my kids that are sort of 8, 10, they are still doing sort of 12, 14 hours a week for my 10-year-old. But the reality there is they're also doing basketball, gymnastics, soccer, like all these other things, again, to ensure that they're still, again, getting the hours, getting the volume so they can actually improve, but having that strong body that enables you to really, again, perform some pretty amazing acts. I know one photo I love is, some of you have seen it, it's Djokovic in that Spider-Man pose where he's in range, almost at full splits after defending on an out wide to his forehand. It's amazing what you can see what these people have doing that have dedicated their life to the sport.
Yeah, I think that the beauty of the Australian system and the school system, especially kids who go to private schools, for example, they have access to summer sport and winter sports. So we've got kids who might be in the Voyager program who also play soccer in winter. They also play basketball in summer alongside tennis training. I think it's important to understand that, as I said before, to get better at tennis, as Luke said, you have to play tennis. You have to be competing. To move through the ranks of getting to that top level, you need to be competing. All I would say is dedicate 1 to 2 hours in the week. If you're looking to, if your kids are already doing private sessions and you're looking for that extra private session with a coach, use that time differently. Use that time to just work on general athleticism. And I guarantee most parents will see the benefits of it.
Yeah, it's I know for us with our full timers, again, I think we're quite fortunate. They're sort of training that 17 hours a week, and they finish sort of before 5 for our seniors. Sometimes for our fitness sessions, it's playing soccer. It's actually that crossover. And I know we're encouraging some of our guys to. I'd love to see some of our full timers form a basketball team, because that might become one of your cardio sessions, and all the skills and the elements that you can develop through different sports can really help. Because just again, a question for you here, Justin, is how would you define early specialization? Talking about the volume of training, playing one sport versus several.
Yeah, I think early specialization, I look very broadly. If a kid has only played tennis their whole life, they're doing 14 to 15 hours of tennis a week, not doing anything else rather than squad, private, and on top of that, going onto the court and hitting with mum and dad or hitting with a training partner. That's what I see as early specialization. There's a lot of different sports that require a lot of time. Like you have golf, where kids specialize at a young age. They start playing golf at 4 years old, and they haven't tried any of the sports. Swimming is another example. Time in the pool, starting at a young age, not trying any other sports. I think early specialization, if I define it, is just not sampling any other sport in their childhood.
Yeah, and it's I think you can see how it happens naturally as well. Like I know if you sort of think culturally, like the tennis players with great serves. If you think about Americans, obviously Aussies, probably have passed a lot of those countries. Even to me, places like Serbia. Think about their national pastimes. Even one thing that always really interests me is Japanese. And you think about Japanese, their number one sport is actually baseball. So every time I've been there, I'll always see the tennis players with a mitt, and there they are launching that ball, and you can see how they've got great throws. It's the same in the States. Their major sports there are football and obviously baseball again. So that the idea of those skills they develop that really leads to having a great serve. I mean, for me as well, you see some of the countries that it's more football dominated. You can see, like in Spain, they typically don't have great serves because they don't have great throws, and that can all lead to that. Because it's I was trying to explain to Jan, our academy manager, what a slips cradle was, talking about this, and how, again, for me, playing every sport under the sun, I played absolutely everything, and showing in classic catches like some of the players, and why, to me, I believe that actually leads to having great volleys, like being able to obviously track the ball at high speeds, being able to have soft hands, because you've got a ball that's hard as a rock flying you 140 k's an hour. How do you actually take pace off? And that's where you start seeing, again, you sort of I guess, generalize a lot of the Aussie players of yesteryear having great volleys, because it's the same sort of skills that you actually can see, which translate to other sports. So I definitely feel like it is one thing to, because again, I just really want to stress, we're seeing more and more people want to do more and more hours on court, and sometimes it's getting to the point of diminishing returns, where the kids are fatigued, they're tired, and rather than sort of thinking, hey, how can I look at the idea of freshening things up, make it fun, and having that cross-training element, because it doesn't always have to be structured as well. I think is one thing. It can be different. It can be spontaneous. It's just it can be fun.
I think for one thing I might point out, because I saw that question pop up, is what's a way at home where you can sort of, suss out whether or not your kids specialize a bit too early, especially as they're past Peacock Velocity or at Peacock Velocity. Do simple tests. Can they balance on one leg for 1 minute? Can they hop on one leg? Can they go from side to side without losing balance? Can they lunge on the spot without losing their balance? Those simple skills there, if they can't do that at their age, they've missed something in their early development, in my eyes.
Yeah, and I think you sort of talk about that, because I think that's where you sort of look at what some of the off-court training can look like. Just to some general ideas, if you have any there, Justin.
Yeah, so as I said before, at Precision, I focus on two elements, right? You have your motor skill development, where you're working on running, jumping, landing, throwing, catching, kicking a ball. Then you've got your gym-based movement patterns, which are how to squat, how to lunge, how to control your body better. Something that I'm very big on is what we call variability training. And variability training is essentially, if I'm doing a squat, we're going to do every squat under the sun, so that you're not getting better at an exercise of a back squat, you're getting better at squatting in general. If we're doing a jumping exercise, we might do every jumping exercise that I can think of underneath the sun. So that again, you're not getting better at an exercise like a box jump, but you're actually getting better at force expression. And that's something I'm very big on when I'm working with kids. Number one, making sure that they're having fun through games that are targeted at different movement patterns, but also within the session, making sure that there's areas where we're touching on very technical stuff, such as trunk control. Are they able to resist rotation or resist their back arching when they're moving overhead, which, as we know with tennis, lower back injuries is quite a common issue. So what can we do at a young age to almost mitigate that when they get older? That's a sort of training. And what I might do actually at the end of this, Luke, is I'm happy to give out some samples of training sessions that parents can have a look at. But variability training and becoming a holistic athlete, I believe, is very important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And even you talked about sort of the gamification process, where you can actually make it fun, where it actually doesn't even feel like training. We play a game called Capture the Flag, which we use in vortexes, and there's so many elements there. We can train for 3 hours on court, and the kids can come out, and it's a fitness session. You can say, hey, we're going to do fitness, and all of a sudden it becomes Capture the Flag, which is actually, it's really tough. I mean, the way they sort of try to follow each other, the agility side, and tracking, it's throwing, catching, it's a really cool thing to see. Someone was just telling you how tired they were and they can't do it, to be running at full speed and having the time of their life.
I think the beauty of that is, like, you can implement these sort of ideas. You don't have to, join Precision Athletica to get these ideas. Like for yourself, like you were saying, you're implementing these into warm up.
Yeah.
Right. Kids are having fun, which is the main thing. They're staying in the sport, and as a result, they keep chipping away at training, and they succeed. I think that's the long-term athletic development model that most people should really believe in.
Yeah, 100%, because we do see so many kids leave the sport, and I know we sort of briefly touched on it. For me personally, I was tiny. I remember I had my year 9 school photo that I saw, and a couple of my friends in that year, I came up to their shoulder, and when we caught up for our 5-year reunion, they came up to mine. One of my best mates didn't recognize me, and that's where you sort of see. I viewed that as obviously some disadvantages at the time, but in the long run, you actually see the huge advantage that it created. I think that's one of the things in our sport, because there is a lot of conversations at high level at Tennis Australia, because again, we reward so much to kids that are skillful quite early. And I mean, on the men's side, for me, at 6'2" and 188 centimeters, I was actually at average height. A lot of the players are really big, really strong, really fast. And that's where I feel like we actually don't have as many of those athletes in the sport, because typically at an early point, they're actually not as skilled. They're not as fast. They don't have the ability to get their body around the court like what you touched on. And it's, it's quite interesting to see.
I think like when you talk about that, have a look at the flip side of the coin. You have the reality is, a lot of athletes won't make it to the top level, unfortunately. That's just the grim reality of sport in Australia, right? So as parents, you want to give your child every opportunity to live healthy lives. Being able to be a bit more diverse and having a bit more variety early gives them confidence to do different things when they get older, and more importantly, remain physically active as they get older. So whether or not that's tennis at the elite level, whether or not they're playing, social tennis, whether or not they're playing any other sports, as long as they're staying physically active, I think as parents and as a head of junior development, that's, in my eyes, is success.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, I can see more questions. If anyone does, please feel free to either raise your hand and ask them, or put it in the chat box. Because again, this is to give you an opportunity here to answer this: is at what age should a kid specialize?
Yeah, I think when we talk about sampling, and sampling obviously should end at some point. Okay, and at some point, kids need to move away from playing a lot of different sports and start to specialize if they're ever going to get to that elite stage. In my mind, that should happen post Peacock Velocity, right? So you've developed this good foundation over 4 to 5 years, starting at 10 years old all the way to 14, 15, and then a lot of different sporting academies. That's when they start as well. So that's the point where I would suggest, all right, what does my child actually want to do? I think at that age as well, kids also have a better understanding of where they want to go. Emotional maturity wise, you might have a 12-year-old who says, oh, I want to play tennis, dad, but they don't really know yet. A 16-year-old definitely has a better idea and a better internal intrinsic drive to push hard at tennis if that's what they really want to do. So I think it's not just looking at the growth and maturation, but also looking at emotional maturity. Are they able to make a sound decision to say, all right, dad, I'm going to commit to that sport now. This is what I want to do. Those are the signs that I'd look for to say, all right, this is where I'm going to put and invest all my money into my child to now work towards, playing tennis at the top level.
I definitely have the same sort of response there. Is when that specialization happens, it is post Peacock Velocity. I think it's an interesting one though. Tennis is a unique sport where if you had an Usain Bolt type athlete and you put a tennis racket into his hand at 14, and he had no volume under his belt, it'd be I'd say it's very, very difficult for him to succeed, because there still is that, again, I'm talking about at a really high level. So I'm not saying, hopefully I'm not saying a bit controversial here for you, Justin, because he's such a good athlete, but there still is that repetition that's needed. So I think that's where it definitely, I'm a big believer that it does help to have that early start. And when it's done in a healthy, nurturing environment where it's done on love and passion, I think this is the key thing too for me is always, I find that the volume that we look for kids is finding out what their appetite is and giving them a little bit less. So they're still hungry. And that's where, from a tennis specific perspective, and I feel like that's where it's quite fortunate for us with full-time academy, because there's so many hours part of the day where there's no sacrifice. There's going to school, they're having a great time. I think it's a really interesting thing. And that gives them the opportunity to do more. But I still feel like it's important to find that balance on top of what you're doing, because there's tennis is such a unique sport, but it does take thousands of hours to find that repetition. But I'm just finding right now a lot of people that are doing a lot of hours are actually overlooking the importance of taking care of their body and how to do that. I think that's a really, really key thing there in finding that balance of still getting enough volume, so you can repeat the action of hitting the ball in court and all the things that come through that. But again, not limiting your athletic capacity through specializing too early. So yeah, I think it's a key thing, because there's a really good question here as well from what is a good proportion of the physical conditioning to the hours hitting on court for a junior that's 10 to 12 years of age?
Well, it's interesting. So for you, Luke, I think that's a good question for you to answer. Like, how much does a 12-year-old actually spend on court at Voyager?
Yeah, well, and again, this is where I think something that I'm still sort of learning more about. I know, again, a lot of the experts in the States, they had so kids were doing big hours. Like we're talking big hours. They're talking about sort of upward of sort of 16 to 18 hours. And that's huge hours. To me, what I would sort of question there's a lot of questions on the variables of what's the quality like. Can you actually get the same result from less? I think yes, if there's better quality. So that's what I'd like to see. What's the intensity? What's the purpose? But I think if you're looking at the idea, and again, it depends on the outcomes you're looking for. But if you do want to be on the higher end, sort of, we do, I think we've got a sort of 3 or 4 of our players that are sort of really tracking quite nicely. That sort of age, they're sort of upward of that sort of 14 to 16 hours on court, which is big, but they're also doing extra things to enable them to stay on the court. And that's one thing I think is really, really important, is if you do have that on the higher end of the scale, and keep in mind, these kids have gone from starting quite early and building to that point. They haven't gone from, again, and my daughter's just joined our program, that full-time program. So she started on 10 hours a week in this term, her second term, and she had some niggles along the way. Obviously managed that really good. We've actually increased an hour this term. We're going to monitor that. But I think that's where I'd be looking for that as being a key factor. But that's where you see kids probably 16 to 18 years of age that want to be on a world scale. They're around that sort of 20 hours a week and probably 10 to 12 hours off court in what I've seen. So that's where I think for kids that sort of 10 to 12 realistically is probably, again, that sort of 10 to 12, maybe 14 hours a week on court. And then again, another probably 6 to 8 hours of off court work. And that off court work might be playing basketball. It might be doing gymnastics. So it's obviously a multitude of different things, not just sort of getting in a gym or doing specific sessions with exercise physiologists and strength conditioning trainers.
Yeah, I think to answer that question from my end, it's strength and conditioning is very different for a junior athlete compared to an adult, right? So the way that we get strength adaptation is totally different. For a junior, they get stronger through what we call neuromuscular changes. And neuromuscular changes is the brain rewiring the way that they move to move more efficiently. Now, this could mean that they need to spend 1 hour off court doing specific stuff to help with their physical development. But then when it comes to an adult, where they get stronger through morphological changes or increase in muscle fiber, you need to have a bit more. You need to have 2 to 3 sessions a week of consistent strength training to get stronger. So I think it depends on how old the child is and how much available time you have off court.
Yeah. Yeah, and that availability is so critical. We know how busy Sydney life is. And that's one of the things I feel like we see some people trying to really battle and grapple with how to manage that. That tough one. It's a one equality. And again, it's great to see questions flying through. And so here's a good one for you. Obviously, talking about time, and it's do you subscribe to Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule?
Yep, I think 10,000 hours is a good number, but what does that 10,000 hours actually look like? What's the distribution of that 10,000 hours is my question. Is 10,000 hours purely playing hidden balls? Is 10,000 hours doing different things to complement hitting balls on court? I think distribution, it depends on what sport you play as well. Tennis, as Luke said, is a very repetition-based sport, so you need that repetition. But I think, 10,000 hours has been that figure that's a lot of, old school thinking. I think it's more important to think about what is the distribution of that 10,000 hours in physical development. Yeah. But takes time for mastery, of course.
It does. It does. It does. Is there anything I'm missing? Obviously, we talk about the long-term model for athletic success. Is that something you'd want to probably touch on before we start sort of wrapping it up?
Yeah, like I can quickly touch on what we do in Voyager, I guess, at Precision.
Yeah.
So we currently run the off-court program and physical development for year 10 to 12. So they come in every Tuesday and Thursday. We actually, I just saw them, 3 hours ago at Precision, working on injury prevention and strength and power development to complement what they're doing on court at Voyager. What's really interesting is that what we look to do is obviously increase physical capacity at the top level with the year 12s to get them ready for what they're going to do after, whether that's college or chasing like that professional life. But what we look to do as well is, where are the year 10s at the moment? What is the physical capacity requirement at year 12? And then structure a way to really get that long-term athlete development model. More so, we have a lot of juniors working with myself and Jason, as young as year 5 and year 6 at the moment. So it's never too early to start that process, because as I said before, kids get stronger by doing more off court. They get stronger by being more adaptable. So, the process of refining skills and introducing strength at an early age can only benefit or junior athletes.
Yeah, it's and again, it's good to see how that sort of transformation's been done. I know we've been working now for a number of years, and a lot of these kids have been working their bodies, and I think that's one of the things that we've seen, how there's really been a lot of success for these kids, because they're really, again, becoming more resilient. I think that's one of the things we're definitely seeing, far less injuries and being able to sort of, again, perform at a much higher level, which is great. And I know that there are definitely a lot more of our youngsters that are coming in to start early, because starting early is a good advantage, and that's, I think, hopefully there's been some bits and pieces here for people they can take from this, because we just see the best athletes on both the ATP and WTA tour, and it really is such a huge advantage.
Perfect.
Yeah. What I'd say as well, we definitely love to, it's been some really good sort of topics there. If there's any more questions in and around that, I'd say there's something here, Nikki, happy to answer that to you. Let's get you some information after this webinar. I can get that across. We've got a question here around load management. See a lot of conditioning and fitness still based on running, even though tennis is already heavy on legs. What are your thoughts on cross training for fitness, especially cardio activities with less impact on the legs, such as boxing and swimming?
Love it. So at the end of the day, training is a stress on the body. Okay. So if you're predominantly a sport where you're doing a lot of time on feet, running, field sports, court sports, I think a good way to top up on that aerobic fitness, if you need to, is doing, cycling, swimming, boxing, anything to take load off the lower body as an extra or top up aerobic conditioning session is a great idea.
Yeah, and it's I think the sparring, the boxing, not sure about getting in the ring and actually having fights is what we're talking about there. But the training for boxing, I know I used to do a lot of that too when I was sort of coming through at that age, and it really is, staying on the pads. That was one of the best. I felt like that was actually one of the greatest sessions that you could do, where at the beginning you get gassed really, really quickly, and you can feel weak and the jelly arms and jelly legs and how it can really get to you, but how that then transfers. I felt like that was actually a really, really great, a great way to do it. But again, I know sort of a lot of you see a lot of the pros and the way they're training, a lot of their sort of long distance runs. I know for me, when we do that, it's more around the mentality that we're looking for. It's actually trying to build that mental strength for people to be able to push through the pain. Something you can measure quite easily. We try to do it on soft grass so we don't sort of exacerbate some of those load issues that we see for the kids on the hard courts. But
yeah, I think it's like, Well, when you talk about something like boxing, or let's call it boxercise, for example, in sports like tennis, it's an individual sport where there's not a lot of contact. And so if you're specializing at a young age and you haven't played any contact sport where there's that physical aspect to it, what I've found in the gym is it's really hard to teach a child how to move with intent, right? How can we jump a bit higher? How can we push a weight a bit faster? That transfers onto the court, right? Like how can we hit a bit harder? How can we accelerate a bit faster? So having those cues like boxing where you're hitting bags not only improves aerobic fitness, but it improves that intensity factor in training and in competition.
Yeah,
It's funny.
It definitely. No, it does. I mean, even there, like I look at all these sort of things. I'm trying to think back to I used to swim. I mean, I felt like my lung capacity increased. Like when I used to do boxing sessions, I used to do spin classes, I used to do yoga, all these sort of things that lead into allowing you to really develop all these different areas of your body, and definitely something we really encourage. Simple as playing basketball as well. Like it's all really good things. Basketball, soccer, I mean, cricket. I don't know if we all have spare 6 hours on Saturday to go play, but it all definitely leads to that. And I think too, as well, for those, I can see, I know there's some young families in here. It might be try a different sport every term. As simple as that. Sign up for soccer. Sign the kids up for basketball. I mean, it's a fun way to break up the week. But again, we're doing pretty well for time here. If there's no sort of other questions, I'd probably sort of again to wrap it up. I mean, any final thoughts for you, Justin, to share with our families tonight?
I think I go back to the goal of the first question we posed earlier, the goal of off-court development. Okay, so in reality, there's two things I always fall back to. We want to create very adaptable athletes, and we want to keep athletes on court. If we're able to do that over a long period of time, we're able to really optimize their ability to become top athletes. And that's simply it.
Yeah,
straightforward message from my end.
Yeah, it is. And no, it's so interesting. I think that's where this sort of modern society where everyone wants everything now, that instant gratification and trying to improve as quick as we can. It's really that concept of that long-term plan, like really being smart around what we're looking for. So that would really be what I'd sort of try to say is, because again, for our athletes to really reach their full potential, it's seen them playing as 26, 27, 28-year-olds. How do we actually get to that point where you can actually stay in the game for long enough to really see the real fruits and joys of as a in your prime to be able to play this sport, because it's a great sport that provides so many different opportunities.
Love it.
Fantastic. Well, Justin, really appreciate your time tonight. And I know you mentioned that there's an opportunity there to send through a training, some examples, some training programs, some exercises.
100%. Like what I'd say is if any of the parents have any questions that they'd like to pose to me privately, like I'm more than happy to answer any questions. If Luke, if you want to hand out my email, which is justin.t@precisionathletica.com.au, but I'll definitely send through a couple of samples of training programs that I would use at Precision that Luke can hand out just to start the process, just to give parents a better idea of what we do at Precision.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll share that to everyone that's actually signed up tonight. So, yeah, fantastic. Again, really appreciate your time, and hopefully there's some of those key messages there that more is not necessarily better. Obviously, there is the appropriate volume that's required, but how we can actually use these other sports to prevent burnout, to actually create that much bigger base for us to really sort of play at a much higher level.
Totally agree with that.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Justin. Thanks for everyone for tuning in tonight, and enjoy.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.